In the small town where I grew up, every hot summer afternoon, a certain ritual occurred: the coming of the ice cream man. I hung out every day with a group of good friends. We all had chores to do in the morning: mowing lawns, sweeping porches, running errands for our parents. But the afternoons were spent riding our bikes, going to the pool, playing baseball in the schoolyard, and exploring the woods. But we had to be back in our neighborhood by 3 o'clock every afternoon. Otherwise, we would miss the ice cream man. He drove an old bright pink Dodge van with loudspeakers mounted on the top that blared out obnoxious tinkling versions of songs like Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead and Pop Goes the Weasel. You could hear him coming from a mile away, and if you had saved up a few nickels from doing odd jobs, you could treat yourself to a fudgesicle, or my personal favorite, an orange creamsicle. And if you were really flush with cash, you could splurge on one of those ice cream waffle cones topped with fudge and peanuts. Those were so awesome. The ice cream man was as reliable as the sun coming up every morning, but one afternoon, as my gang of friends waited in the shade of an old oak tree in a neighbor's front yard, the ice cream man, he never showed up. 3 o'clock came and went. We stuck around the area just in case, but nothing. No Pop Goes the Weasel anywhere in the distance. We were mystified. Did he have a flat tire? Maybe an accident? Eventually, we all made our way back home. We told ourselves, tomorrow is another day. He'll return. There had to be a reasonable explanation. But tomorrow came, and again, no ice cream man. Now we were really dumbfounded. It just wasn't right. We were reliable customers, after all. He always came our way, and he always told us he'd see us the very next day. So we came up with all kinds of conspiracy theories. Maybe he had ran out of ice cream, or he'd been hijacked and his truck was sitting empty somewhere out in the country. Had he been kidnapped? Maybe he'd been abducted by aliens, or worse, the Russians. Whatever it was very unsettling. It went on like that for an entire week, and our mood grew worse with each passing day. We thought about going to the sheriff's office to file a missing ice cream man report, but we didn't think we'd be taken seriously. But maybe there was widespread ice cream fraud, and we could try to prove it in court, even though we had no evidence to back up our wild claims. By the end of that week, one of my friends said that it was time for us to give up and move on with our lives. We should never expect him to come back. But then, the following Monday, we were playing outside as usual, and someone yelled, "Stop!" And in the distance, we could hear it, faintly, that music growing closer. And sure enough, here came the ice cream man, just as if nothing had ever happened. Most of us were too afraid to ask him where he'd been, although we all looked him over carefully to see if there were any obvious signs of alien abduction and torture. Finally, one of my friends said, "Where have you been?" The ice cream man said, "Oh, you mean last week? Vacation. I took my kids down to the beach. See you tomorrow." We stared at each other and thought, there are kids in this world whose father is an ice cream man? That would be so amazing. Ice cream all the time, day and night. But really, what kind of ice cream man takes a vacation in the middle of the summer? Apparently, someone who really loves his kids. Now, I would never in a million years equate that childhood experience with anything the earliest Christians endured. Now, that being said, none of us like waiting for something we eagerly anticipate. 2,000 years ago, the region around the Mediterranean, it was populated by a growing number of congregations just full of people who anticipated that Jesus Christ would return in their lifetime. They had been taught to believe that Jesus would come back in a very dramatic and public way and usher in a kingdom of peace, and that the time of persecution many of them suffered would finally come to an end. They were persecuted in the first place because that often happens to groups who do things a little bit differently and who are perceived by the powers that be as dangerous to social stability. Christians were an easy target whenever things went sideways. Someone you could conveniently blame for problems caused really by government mismanagement or just a public health crisis no one could control. The Christians behaved oddly. They never showed up at the expected places of public worship. When it was good common sense to leave town whenever a plague descended, the Christians would stay and tend to the sick and dying. So it wasn't a far stretch to twist logic and accuse them of being the ones responsible for the illness. On top of official persecution was social pressure, family pressure. By not participating in the normal public rituals, Christians were ostracized by their neighbors. Their families disowned them. If someone learned you were a Christian, you might lose your job or your home. That's why in the catacombs of ancient Roman cities today, you can still find etched into the stone the secret symbols Christians used to communicate with each other. No one else is going to go down there in the realm of the dead. Quite a bit different from where we are today, when the birth of Jesus is an official national holiday and we celebrate it by buying lots of stuff and eating way too much. The early Christians would have never imagined their faith would morph into something like that. In the midst of all the suffering they went through, one of the main things that kept those Christians going was the belief that any day now Christ would return to make all things right. In the correspondence between the leaders of the church, like Paul and Peter, and the members of those churches, all of those letters that make up the bulk of the New Testament, that anticipation and the message of just wait, keep the faith, he's coming back at any time to purify the world, that comes through loud and clear over and over again. So it's not surprising that in all of the watching and waiting, some of them came up with different theories of why it hadn't happened quite yet. Maybe Jesus had already come back, but they just didn't know about it. The news had not reached them yet, but maybe it wouldn't be like what they imagined. Maybe they weren't praying hard enough, or they weren't living godly lives sufficiently. About the same time Peter wrote his letters, the first generation of Christians began passing away. And within a few hundred years, they were no longer even being persecuted, and Christianity in the Roman Empire had become an officially recognized religion. And not too long after that, it became the official state religion. So Christians during the first few hundred years of the movement were left with one of two options because Christ had not returned yet. Option one was, well, he's still coming back in a way that will radically transform the whole world all at once, but we just don't know when. Or option two, Christ doesn't come back in a way that we expect. So it's not a matter of some huge supernatural event that we wait around for. It's understanding that his return is something that happens on an ongoing basis. It's not restricted to chronological time. It's always happening, and in small and insignificant ways, and we call those moments sacred time. Those two parallel strands of belief about the return of Christ have defined Christianity ever since those early days. Some Christians, many in fact, still believe that he will indeed return in glory and in a very public and dramatic way to judge the living and the dead, as that old confession goes. While other Christians, also very many, don't focus their energy so much on a dramatic return at some point in the future, but an ongoing manifestation of Christ in the present. And as a third option, many Christians believe in a blending of those two perspectives, future and present. Now, are any of those ideas wrong, while only one is correct? Honestly, can't say. I personally lean in the direction of not being too concerned about a future dramatic return of Christ. I figure if that happens, it'll happen whenever God wants it to happen, and that's fine with me. God's timeline is God's prerogative, but it does seem like if it was going to happen, there have been plenty of nice opportunities in history when it would have made a positive difference. Lots of human misery that could have been avoided if Christ had descended on a cloud to save the day. So I'm much more inclined toward the idea that Christ returns and Christ is made real in the here and now through you and me in the midst of a very imperfect and hurting world. But being focused on how Christ is made real in the present does not mean we stop spending time watching and waiting. We absolutely do. We anticipate those moments, and we celebrate them whenever they arrive. And Peter, in his letter, calls that way of being desiring earnestly. Truth is, we know from experience that year-round, if we're alert, the presence of Christ returns on a regular basis because Christ is made real and comes into our consciousness whenever self-giving love happens. But I think we also want a special moment to celebrate that, and that's why Christmas means what it does for us. The gift of Christ coming into the world on a particular day in history in a particular place tells us that gift can arrive at any day and anywhere. Here's just one example among so many. Annie Sheridan lives in Santa Clarita, California. Annie is disabled, and she's the single mom of a 10-year-old boy. Now, she had fallen on hard times back in April when her ex-husband stopped paying child support. It was her only source of income, and it happened just as the pandemic was kicking into high gear. Annie and her son were evicted from their apartment and found themselves homeless, living week to week in a motel. One day she went to the grocery store, but it was not until she made it to the cash register that she realized her debit card did not have enough money in the account, and she had no cash to cover the entire purchase. She said, "While I was trying to figure out what in the world, what groceries I needed to put back, Charlie, the cashier, pulled out his credit card and paid the remainder of my bill in the amount of $32.35. She objected, offered to pay him back, but Charlie insisted, telling Annie it was his pleasure. She said, "I was in tears and just blown away. I didn't know what to say. All I could do was thank him over and over again because it wasn't just like it was $5 or $8. It was $32.35, and that's a huge deal. It's a lot of money." She said, "When somebody does something like that, it's just so tremendous. Maybe it's the human thing to do, but I never expected it to happen for me. Maybe it's the human thing to do." I believe Annie's right, but not all humans would do that. The return of Christ happens, though, when the human heart is moved to act in self-giving love. It's often unexpected. It can happen, as Jesus said, at any moment, at any hour of the day or night, and at any place. It's something we earnestly desire, and if we keep our eyes and ears and hearts open, we recognize it. And the wonderful thing is, the more that we seek it, the more that we anticipate it, the more we experience it, and the more that we do likewise. So let's anticipate Christmas together. Let's celebrate on that special day what happens in our world and in our lives every day, the coming of Christ.